fossil fuels in heat and power production, and of course also be used for timber in house buildings. All of this reduce climate impact. The birds you see there, they may be harvested in, for example, the year 2050, when peak oil and perhaps more severe climate problems has made it still more important to produce bioenergy. And the disposition for my talk start with that large areas of Swedish agricultural land have been afforested, so trees on agricultural land is nothing new. When I'm going to talk about the sequestration and fossil fuel substitution, how to calculate it, and will more afforestation be accepted? I think that more trees on agricultural land can be good for the climate, but I'm not sure that it will be accepted, because Swedish people want open landscape and so on, and they don't like spruce plantation on agricultural land. So I will also give some examples of environmentally friendly afforestation. And the last point is afforestation in the suggestions for roadmap 2050 done by the Environment Protection Agency. The aim of the roadmap is to find ways to make net emissions of greenhouse gases zero the year 2050. And here is the history. The green curve at the bottom shows that the area of natural grassland for grazing and haymaking has decreased very much since 1890. It decreased even before that year. Arable land, the red line, increased up to the 1930s, and after that this has decreased. And total area of agricultural land was 100 years ago about 5 million hectares in Sweden, and now it's only 3 million hectares. 2 million hectares has left agriculture, and most of that has become forest. Of course, a little have been built up areas with houses and roads and so on, but most has been afforested. And in the beginning of the 20th century, we also had large areas of grazed forest in Sweden. And in 1923, there were 0.7 million hectares of grazed forest, and before it was still more. So, afforestation of agricultural land is nothing new. Here is forest grazing, perhaps 100 years ago. Very low production of timber in such grazed forests. And an important task for the country boards of forestry was to get the animals away from the forest and to plant or naturally regenerate trees on that land. And they wrote in a report from 1945, we have very good reasons to regard the experience of the forest grazing as an insignificant loss to agriculture and a great advantage to forestry. It was an insignificant loss because at that time we have started producing clover, grass, lace for grazing on arable land. That pasture was higher producing and higher quality, suitable for the still more producing cows and so on. And that it had been a good advantage for forestry is illustrated by the example at the bottom of the picture. An area they stopped grazing in the 1930s. It became natural generation. They cleaned it and thinned it 2-3 times, and it was a final felling in 2011, and the net of that was nearly 4 million Swedish kronor, nearly 200,000 kronor per hectare, and also the Finns gave some net incomes. So doing nothing but taking the animals away generate a lot of money. Active in afforestation had its peak in the 1950s and 60s, and at that time spruce was nearly the only trees that were planted. And now this spruce forest can look like the upper picture at the right, a semi-open landscape, or perhaps as on the left bottom, it has already been harvested. And in the background you see slash, what we call in Sweden grot, that will be used for bioenergy. The bottom right is another forest from the 1960s, but in that case it was natural generation. The farmers like to have more open landscape, and manage birds in Finland got that landscape also graze some sort of agroforestry. That is not common now, but perhaps it might be a model for the future. And in the 1990s, in the beginning of that decade, we had an adjustment program in Sweden. We should adjust the agriculture to freer market. And one way of doing that was to help farmers go from unprofitable farm agriculture production on marginal land to afforestation. And it was subsidized, especially broadleaf trees. This birch was, from that time, it is at that picture about 10 years old. And now it's 20-year-old at the top on the right-hand side. In other cases, as in the bottom left, this was a mixture of different broadleaf trees in southern plains of Sweden, oak, beech, wild cherry. I think it's wild cherry who's flowering there, and that's a good increase the variability and biodiversity in the plains. And in the bottom right you see salix. That was another alternative at that time, and it was thought that it should be several hundred thousands of salix in the future, but it has instead decreased, so now it's not very much more than 10,000 hectares. So how could we calculate the climate mitigation of having more trees on agricultural land? In the forestry sector, they have done a lot of such studies, and I show this picture because it illustrates how it can be calculated. So this is for spruce on ordinary forest land in Sweden. We start at year 0 here, and all carbon in the forest soil is ignored. And the trees start to grow, and you see that tree biomass increase, coal in tree biomass, and also black, that is soil carbon, that also increase. And if we look at the lower combination, sorry, first I should say that this is from a large study where they have compared a lot of models of using managing the spruce forest, and also different kinds of using the products. And the lowest combination, that is the one that has the least climate mitigation effects, where the growth is 7 cubic meter per hectares. Slash and stumps are not harvested, and the wood is only used for replacing natural gas in heat and power production. At the bottom is the highest combination, the best mitigation alternatives, where the growth is 10 cubic meter because it is fertilized, Slash and stumps are harvested and used in producing heat and power. And most of the trees is used for timber, substituting concrete and metals and so on in house building. And the biofuel part is used for substituting coal. And you see that you start the first rotation, it will be coal in the tree biomass, and also to some extent in the soil, the black part. But after you have harvested, after about 90 years in the upper one and 70 years in the lower one where the growth is faster, you get this ribbed area illustrating the substitution effect. They substitute fossil fuel and concrete in buildings and so on. And you see in the long run, the substitution effect is the most important. But in the short run, the first 50, 60, 70 years, the uptake in the tree biomass is the most important. And if we plant trees on agricultural land producing not 10 cubic meter, but perhaps 13, 14 if you have spruce, and 20 if you have hybrid aspen, the curve will be much steeper. And here is figures about the average uptake of carbon dioxide in the tree biomass and in the substitution of fossil fuels. And this is the average for a rotation. If you see at the tree biomass about 1,400 kilograms carbon dioxide per cubic meters, it is a little bit more in birch than in spruce because the birch have higher density. And according to Elander, 2011, it will be 700 kilograms of carbon dioxide per cubic meters. Under that 1400 Kumm, I will show you results from calculations, and where I suppose it is only 1400 or not 1700 in birch. And if you see the substitution effect, I also use lower figures, because I will not overestimate the possibility, but to be a little bit conservative, I think. And at the right-hand side, let's increment the growth every year per hectare. And also there I have used lower figures than in other estimates. And at the bottom you see Kumm 2011 birch. I suppose the average growth is 8 cubic meter. And birch in pastures, that's some sort of agroforestry, where I suppose we have birch growing 2 cubic meter per hectare. It's only 25% of the birch production if it's only birch. So 75% is still grass. And birch on agroforestry on arable land, where I suppose it's 4 cubic meter, half the production of birch in enclosed birch stands. And if we use these figures and calculate the sequestration in tree biomass and emission avoided due to substitution in kilogram of carbon dioxide per hectare and years, you see these figures. For example, if you plant spruce growing 13 cubic meters and 1400 kilograms of carbon dioxide per hectare, it will be a little bit more than 18 tons per hectare and year sequestration in the tree biomass, and the substitution effect is about half that. If you have birch, it will be less because the growth is not so high. And you see at the bottom hybrid aspen growing 18 cubic meters, but only 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter, because the density of aspen wood is lower than in for example, birch. Early this week I I went to a farm in north of Uppsala, Sätuna, where I afforestated large areas of agricultural land. And there I had hybrid aspen stands 20 years old, producing not 18 but 25 cubic meters per hectare in years. And we use these figures. Hybrid aspen will sequestrate much more than 20 tons per hectare in years. And we can recalculate that to 1 million hectares. So this is how much the sequestration in tree biomass emission avoided due to substitution if we afforestate 1 million hectares. I don't say that we should afforestate so much, but it's if it will be 500,000 hectares, it will be half of these figures. And you see, if we use spruce or hybrid aspen, it will be 18 million tons of carbon dioxide. Less if it is birch. Total emission from Swedish agriculture of greenhouse gases is about 10 million tons. So sequestration of, if we use spruce or hybrid aspen, if we afforestate 0.6 million hectares, that will compensate all the emission of greenhouse gases from all the Swedish agriculture. If we use birch, it will only be, we must afforestate 0.9 million hectares. And if we want to compensate half the emissions, it's okay with 0.3 million hectares of spruce or 0.45 of birch. Now I go to animal meat production and interest goals in that production. This is emissions of carbon dioxide per kilogram of produced meat. And you see the best one is broiler and the pork is nearly as good, only 3-4 kilograms of carbon dioxide per produced kilogram of meat. If we have lamb production, it's about 15 kilograms per kilogram of meat produced. If we have beef production based on care from the dairy production, it's also about 15 kilograms. And if we have suckle cows-based beef production, it's about 20 kilograms. So if the goal is to reduce climate impact from our consumption, we should eat broiler or pork. But if the goal is to keep the landscape open, even in forest-dominated areas of the country, and preserve high biodiversity in semi-natural pastures, we should eat beef and lamb. So we have a conflict between different interests. Perhaps it can be solved by having growing trees in the pastures. The upper bar in each here is the result, gross emissions I showed you in the picture before. The green bars, if we take into account the sequestration in ley for production of silage and a little part of the grazing of the cattle, the emissions for example, lamb production will be decreased from 15 to 12 kilogram. But if you look at the red here, greenhouse emissions from production minus sequestration in the land, in the ley production for silage, and 2 cubic meters of tree growth in the pastures. All two, as I said just before, 2 cubic meters is only 25% of the total production. 75% is still grass. The sequestration of these trees is so big, so for lamb and for steer of dairy breed, the net emission will be below zero. And also in the case of suckle cow beef production. This sequestration happens as long as the biomass in the trees increase, but after harvesting, that effect of increasing biomass will disappear. But in the long run, for hundreds of years, if we continue, we can use the produced tree wood for substituting fossil fuels. And in that case, you get the blue bars. And that will result in zero emissions for lamb, for steer dairy breed. It's about the emissions from pork production. So you see that even if I've been conservative in estimating the tree growth and the sequestration, growing trees can have a very good effect of reducing climate impact. So it can look like this in our pastures. In the foreground, we have a pasture without any trees. In the middle of the picture, we have growing birch in the pasture. And in the middle here, the growth of the birch is higher than 2 cubic meters per hectare and years. So if we have these beef cows in combination with a forest like the birch in the middle here, the net emission of the beef production will be below zero. And in environmental protection agencies' environmental objectives, they say the climate goals must be achieved in such a way that biodiversity is preserved. And if a biodiversity is preserved, if we have birch stands as in the middle here, that's okay. We both preserve the biodiversity and we reduce the climate impact. Here is about the profitability for the landowner of growing trees in the agricultural landscape. 10 minutes left? Good. The first point here is from the report from Swedish Board of Agriculture. It says that if a single farm payment, that is payment that the farmers get independently of if they use the land for food production or if they don't use it, but they must keep the forest away. If that payment is forced out, traditional afforestation or energy forestry will be on at least 1 million hectares in the long run. So huge areas. And below that I show some calculations results about the profitability. NAV means net annual value of the production. For example, for spruce in 46 years rotation and 3% interest, it will pay 2,000 kronor per hectare and years. Birch planted on fenced for protecting it from roe deer and hare and elk and so on. If that fence cost 20,000 kronor per hectare, it will be not profitable because of the high cost of fencing. But if we have the birch naturally generated with 39 plus 10 years, 10 years is the time before it has happened, this generation, and after that 39 years rotation, it can pay 1,500 kronor per hectare in years. And hybrid aspen can pay nearly 2,000 kronor. If the growth is 19 cubic meter per hectare in years, if it grows 25 cubic meter, as the example I told you, it will perhaps be better. So without any subsidy, forest growing on arable land can be profitable. But now it stopped by its single farm payment. And of course, the attitudes to afforestation. Large landowners have an open mind to afforestation, but smaller ones are generally negative, according to Frank Petrini's study from the 1960s. Small farmers, when they ceased, for example, meat production and take a job in town, they find it better to have a few beef cattle or a flock of sheep instead of grazing, instead of afforestation. And a study about willingness to pay for preserving open agricultural land or grazed pasture suggests that the willingness to pay for keeping the spruce away from cemented pasture is about 4,000 kronor per hectare and years, and the willingness to pay for keeping the spruce away from arable land was 2,000 kronor per hectare and years. That is in the value of money of 2010. Do not plant trees on land opened up by early generation is often an answer if we discuss with a farmer about planting trees on his agricultural land. Afforestation is easier to accept if known that it mitigates climate change. Broadleaf trees, better than spruce, but spruce accepted in remote locations, small open agricultural land in the forest, far away from where anyone lives. And silvopasture agroforestry has about the same landscape values as arable land, according to studies Lars Rake and I did in the 1990s. So perhaps environmental adjusted afforestation can be accepted, but perhaps not spruce. Here you have some illustration how it can look like. Grassland, the other at the top, they have stopped cattle production, and it's perhaps kept open by single farm payment. If you plant spruce at the right of the road, you see how it can look like after 10 years and on the other side after 20 years. Natural generation in the middle at the left-hand side. Birch plantation at the bottom. For me it looks much nicer than the spruce at least, and perhaps can be still nicer for at least some people if it's only grazing and that sort of agri-forestry systems. I think it is important to repeat the studies about willingness to pay from the 80s, where spruce was the only alternative, and also have this sort of alternative with broadleaf trees and perhaps also agroforestry. Carbon farming is a thing now discussed in, for example, Australia and New Zealand. Farmers in Australia and New Zealand can get carbon credits for sequestering carbon in trees, including silvopasture agroforestry. You see at the top that is radiata pines grown in, for example, 100 stems per hectare, pruned and grassed under. At the bottom, we have planted poplars in pastures, and at the right-hand side bottom, it's massive pine plantation. But they get carbon credits for all this sort of afforestation. If the same would happen in Sweden, it will make afforestation still more profitable and a competitive alternative on marginal agricultural land. At the top here, on the right-hand side, I think you don't see so much because it is topsoil dust in the air. It's wind erosion. You perhaps see a tractor harrowing arable land. These sort of erosion problems can be decreased if we plant windbreak trees, as at the bottom left. Here we have only one row, but it should perhaps be 2 or 3 rows, and perhaps also a shrub at the bottom planted as on the right-hand picture. It will reduce wind erosion, but also produce bioenergy and sequester. 1 minute. Oh, I have to hurry up. Here you have another sort of forested buffer strips from the United States, also trees producing bioenergy and taking up carbon dioxide and decreasing nitrogen pollution, for example. Agriculture measures, I think I skip that one. That is about this roadmap for Sweden in 2050 without any net emissions of greenhouse gases. And the bottom example here is advisory service to farmers about profitability and climate benefits of afforestation on arable land not in use. I think that is the alternative that has the greatest impact on climate change. And here are my conclusions. Without ended forest grazing and afforestation of, it should be more than 1 million hectare agricultural land, the climate footprints in Sweden would have been much higher. Carbon sequestration and fossil fuel substitution by trees in pastures can make beef and lamb production as smart, climate smart as pork and chicken production. We can go on eating beef and lamb and don't change climate more than if we eat chicken, for example. And carbon sequestration on between 0.6 and 0.9 million hectares can fully compensate the greenhouse emissions from Swedish agriculture for many decades. But landscape-friendly afforestation is necessary for acceptance. Thank you very much.